These recent images appear to show dead bodies of civilians lying on the streets of Bucha. Russian forces recently left this Ukrainian town. Such scenes have prompted many Western leaders to call for a war crimes trial, with the UK Foreign Secretary saying it's very clear that war crimes had taken place. Robert Clark, who served in the British Army for 13 years, explains the evidence needed to call it a war crime.
Was this a war crime in your view?
I think it's certainly, the evidence is starting to appear as though it can be accurately described as a war crime. When we talk about war crimes, it's very important to note the distinction between sort of war crimes, illegal acts of war, and these other sort of terms that quite often get thrown around for understandable reasons. But when we look at war crimes specifically, there's four key sort of criteria one must look at whether it can be accurately described as a war crime. One of them is proportionality, so whether an action or a topic, in this case obviously the apparent killing of unarmed civilians in Ukraine, whether it served whether it was proportional to achieving a military aim. Obviously it wasn't. Another one is military distinction as well, so distinguishing between military targets and civilian targets. Again, for example, a military unit would be considered fair game because it has a military purpose, so there's a military distinction. Unarmed civilians, there is no, that's a very clear distinction. So it does look increasingly like the evidence can be classed as a war crime, yes.
So can you tell me more about what proof is needed to show it's a war crime? Because presumably we won't know until a few years' time.
Well, this is it. It's incredibly difficult to gain accurate and reliable information in a contested war zone like Ukraine. That's the first thing to sort of bear in mind for people, I suppose. In terms of how we can accurately ascertain whether it was a war crime and the evidence needed, for example, there's already the Times, for example, and BBC have had their own sort of independent verification of evidence on the scene. So that helps. There's also the Human Rights Watch. They're on the ground as well, and they're trying to collect evidence, again, which is remarkably brave of them considering the nature of the conflict. So in order for these independent, semi-independent organisations and bodies to collect evidence and present them before both international and national courts of law, then that can be escalated and declared as obviously war crimes or genocide even. And then down the line is obviously the hopeful prosecution of individuals responsible.
In terms of the Chinese regime, they haven't spoken out against what's happened in Bucha, for example. So what's in this for Beijing?
So we can already see several people have commented on the detente between, for example, Moscow and Beijing over this. Obviously, Moscow is increasingly ostracized internationally. They've got increasingly few allies, Belarus and other authoritarian dictatorships. So it goes further than detente between Russia and China. It's now really the co-opting of Russia by China, and China will cash that in. So there's very serious geopolitical issues down the line where Russia will be able to help China with, for example, security in the Arctic. So these will manifest later. This is why China is staying very quiet. They're refusing to acknowledge what's happening, for example, over the last 48 hours. And we can see this continuing to emerge.
When you just said, China is looking to cash that in, what kind of things will they be keeping an eye on?
Sure. So there's so many issues happening right now with Ukraine and the Ukrainian conflict geopolitically, which will have much deeper ramifications than just security in Eastern Europe. So, for example, I mentioned the Arctic, the North Sea Passage. Russia are incredibly defensive about allowing international partners to transit that for trade. Obviously, during the summer months where the waters are clearer. However, China can reduce their commercial maritime trading routes by a third, by obviously not going through the South China Sea and Suez, but going through the North Sea Passage. Russia will undoubtedly give China favourable trading rights and sort of transportation rights for that. And that brings into conflict with NATO, for instance, in the sense that 60% of the Arctic coastline is Canadian, and the majority still is NATO. When we look at how ambitious China are with their blue water maritime navy, this is going to bring a whole host of security-related questions. We can see how aggressive they are in the maritime domain in the South China Sea. We can replicate that across, the North Atlantic, the Arctic, the Mediterranean in years to come. So this is one area where China will undoubtedly hold Russia to account for providing them with intelligence, weapons, and obviously we saw over the weekend the reports that China were humongously implicated in cyber warfare against Ukraine in the run-up to the invasion. So China aren't doing this for free, helping Russia. They will, like I say, cash this in for geopolitical favours in the coming decade. And these are the wider issues that will really sort of become apparent down the line.